I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on Spotlight, we're speaking with author Lloyd Gross. He is a native of New Orleans who is bringing the lost allure of the city's early 20th century charm back to life in his novel, Fried Oyster Sandwich. He is a retired Lutheran pastor with deep interest in history, religion, and culture, and he paints an intricate tapestry of generational narratives using his rich knowledge to craft a vivid alternate history that engages his readers in every page. We're delighted to have Lloyd join us here today on Spotlight. We thank the team at Book Savvy International for helping us put him in the spotlight today. And we ask viewers like you to support writers like him by subscribing to our channel. Lloyd, thanks so much for being our guest.
You're welcome, Logan.
It is a little after lunchtime, talking about fried oyster sandwiches. You're making me hungry, my friend.
Well, it should do that. But I'd like to hunger for more than just food here. I'd like to hunger for culture here.
Exactly.
I'd like to go in that direction.
Yeah.
You were wondering, first of all, why I wrote the book.
Sure.
And I wrote the book because of the Confederacy, plain and simple. I had tried essays and things like that to explain the Confederacy to people. And finally, I said to myself, you need to make a fictional model that works of what the world would have been like for an ordinary family if the Confederates had won the war. So that's what happened. And I made it for 3 generations of the family with some backstory about an additional generation and some children who would become the next generation. Where does it begin? Well, it begins with having this microcosm, which I call the Kaufmann family, spelled the German way, Kaufmann. When was the time for this? Well, the story begins in 1909. And there is some backstory, but mainly the story begins in 1909 with what is called the Lost Generation. What everybody calls the Lost Generation. I think Dorothy Parker originally gave it that name.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's the generation that my grandparents were part of. And around 1909, they would have been courting one another. They would have been about that age in life. There's other generations to come after that, but focusing on that first one, that lost generation. We talk about things like live oaks and crawfish, the New Orleans flora and fauna that are going to be around us throughout this entire book. We get used to walking along a lagoon in Audubon Park. And I had a schoolmate, a classmate from the class of 1960 at Benjamin Franklin Senior High, who was actually doing that with his wife one day. And he was reading this book and said, oh, this is what we're doing now. So it isn't something that far-fetched. At each generation, there is a romantic story, a different way of the couple meeting. And here there's a progression. The lost generation, the couple meets when they're in college. The next generation, the couple meets when they're like 12 and 13. And then finally, the third generation, they meet when they're 8 and 6, when they're in the same house because the one house is being repaired on account of a hurricane. And in chapter, I believe it's chapter 10, this hurricane plays itself out, and you get to actually experience being in it. Now, what about world events? Well, world events are important. And considering that I had to make that world and make those events, that was part of the creation of Fried Oyster Sandwich. One of these had to do with Mexico. In this case, it was the Confederates after winning their war. They had a debt to the French, and they repaid it by helping Maximilian and Carlotta keep their empire, which they do successfully. So Mexico is being ruled by a Habsburg throughout this entire book that is going on. Another point, too, that I try to make is the cuisine. This is mentioned in every chapter. Every chapter has something about what they're eating and how much of it there is, which again is a New Orleans thing. And I suppose that's something most people would ask me about if it came up.
Yeah.
Now, do you want to ask me anything about the book? Then go ahead and do so.
Oh, absolutely. Well, you're obviously a great storyteller. It comes from your days of being a pastor, no doubt, and just being an imaginative person. And the story that you weave about the Kaufman family is quite intriguing indeed. And what one answer question I have that the audience I think would have it also is, well, what would life be like if the Confederacy had won? I mean, I understand its impact on certain families, but what about our liberties? What about life here in the United States as we know it? That kind of thing.
Well, the people in the book have the same kind of life I have, the same kind of life you have. As far as liberties are concerned, that has not been in any way restricted. World events, however, yes, that is restricted. When you come to the First World War, the Confederacy wants to stay out of it. The Union stays out of it too. And how does this work? Well, remember that it was the Confederates who were the main part of the Union that wanted in the war.
Mhm.
With the Confederates out, you have the Midwest, which is full of Germans.
Mhm.
You have the East Coast, which is full of Irish, many of whom are Sinn Feiners and don't like England. And generally, when it comes to this, the United States also stays out of World War I. So what happens? Well, nobody wins it, which means nobody loses it.
Mm.
And if nobody loses it, there's no World War II.
Gotcha.
So you go through the 30s and 40s and 50s in this book, and there is no war going on except in Manchuria. And that's all explained exactly what was happening there. But there is no World War II
Mm.
at all.
What
There is a
you
Russian Revolution, and
right?
it goes the way it went, the way the history books tell you it went. It goes just like that. But this plays into the idea of the Germans don't lose World War I
Right.
because there's no Eastern Front.
Mhm.
That the two sides are just banging away at each other in France.
Mm.
And finally, they say, this is stupid. Let's stop it. they do.
It's very, very interesting. What is your message to readers? What do you want them to take away from this book?
Okay. Uh, First of all, to see the providence of God in all these things, to see the importance of your relationship to God in all these things, to see how we relate to one another in all these things, to see the importance of, well, the way you approach life, the way
Mm.
you think about it, the way you think about your dog, the way you think about any little piece of life that you have there, how wonderful it is to be in a family, and also that people do prosper because of their ingenuity and because of their productivity. Now look at the family, the Kaufman family. We start with the grandfather, who is a ferry boat captain. Then we have Eric, who becomes editor of the Picayune. Then we have Henry, who becomes the manager of a radio station that the newspaper spawns. And then finally, we have the last generation, Martin. And Martin becomes an economist and a collegiate don for all practical purposes. But he becomes so famous at it and so well read at it that he ends up being the governor.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Well, it's an intriguing world you have created. What inspired you to write this?
As I said at the beginning, the vindication of the Confederate States was important to me, but it had to be done in a realistic way.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, the foreign relations, the way they work together, Mexico, all of the, since World War I ended, without anybody losing, all of the empires are still intact,
Mm,
except Russia.
right.
But all the other empires in Europe are still intact. The British Empire, the German Empire, the Austrian Empire, suppose even the Ottoman Empire. I didn't go into any great lengths about it, but all of these were still intact in the 20th century. So what we're looking at is a continuation of the Belle Epoque.
Yeah. It's an amazing story that you have written. It's called Fried Oyster Sandwich. It takes a look at a chapter in history and then rewrites it. And Lloyd Gross has created quite a world. It is a page turner of a book. You'll want to know what happens next because it is limited only by his imagination, which seems to be boundless. Lloyd, thank you so much for joining us here today on Spotlight.
I wanted to say, too, there were two
Sure.
appendices in the book. The first appendix talks about how the Confederates won that war.
Mm-hmm.
And the second appendix talks about how they helped the Habsburgs win their war.
Right.
So those two, appendix A and B. There is an appendix C, but that was just added for fun. There was a list of the presidents of the Confederate States up until 1977.
Well, this is quite a book. I can envision it as a TV series or a movie for sure. So, Hollywood, if you're listening, Lloyd's got a great book here. That would be a terrific script. Lloyd, thanks again for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thank you, Logan.
My
God
pleasure.
bless you.
God bless you. And to the folks at home, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time this time. Until next time on Spotlight.